Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for the survival of Christian civilization, it's got to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to be mindful the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And certainly for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen, and Joel is traveling, so he doesn't have his regular microphone with him, but we're just going to have a little echo there. I think that you'll be able to understand what he's saying, because certainly Joel gives us an excellent overview of the information that he records, the information you're not going to get through regular channels. Joel, go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Stan. It's good to be with you. Our first subject today is going to be on the Ferguson riots, militarization of police on display. Well, the Ferguson, Missouri riots are the modern incarnation of the 1992 Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. In both cases, you had aggressive and sometimes brutal police confrontations with black majorities who were problem people, but who didn't deserve the brutal treatment they received at the hands of police. In both cases, long and deeply held resentment flared up, causing public protests. Criminals and malcontents took advantage of the situation to rush into the melee and begin looting, which in many cases was not properly restrained by police. But what is different in the Ferguson case is that the local police have now become extremely militarized with all the bravado and aggressive behavior that such equipment induces. Forget about local police standing down and being replaced by the state police. Within a day, all the forces were back, including the woefully unprepared National Guard, and the police were more aggressive than before, especially against journalists who had cameras rolling. Well, finally, as the national public debate is getting to see what this purposely misguided policy of giving away billions in military equipment to police has done to America, CNN was running a story on the Ferguson riots with a picture of fully a dozen members of local police in full combat military gear, including Kevlar helmets with eye guards, gas masks, combat boots, camouflaged uniforms, bulletproof vests bulging with ammo pockets, military knee pads, and the automatic rifles with laser sights all pointed at one unarmed black guy with his arms in the air. Is that too much or what? Well, first of all, it's a known bad policy to go around pointing loaded weapons at people unless they are armed and present a serious threat. But this is what journalists see all the time in Ferguson. Amateur military wannabes running around pointing their weapons at civilians as if they're going through a building under fire, like everyone sees in the movies. This Rambo-style macho police force is just looking for an accident to happen. CNN used this picture repeatedly without even noticing that on the blue mailbox there was glaring graffiti painted in white saying, using the F word, the police. Well, the militarization of police is the real problem here. More and more small-town police forces are acquiring M.r.a.p vehicles at no cost from the government, which tear up the streets and are very costly to operate. Besides, there are no mines in Missouri, so who needs 8-ton mine-resistant vehicles? I'm not even buying the story that these supplies were vehicles from Iraq. These are almost new vehicles. I think the U.S. overbought thousands of these with the specific intent of flooding local police departments with military equipment.
Joel, if you just hold that, we're going to go to a break here and bring our other stations on board. Our guest is Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Well, this is Dr. Stan here. Our guest this afternoon, Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Joel is traveling. He doesn't have his regular microphone, so there's a little echo, but still the reception is excellent. And he's talking certainly about the militarization of the police force in Ferguson. And basically, of course, why would certainly you have just a little tiny town, have certainly tanks and armored personnel carriers and all of this military equipment? They're militarizing Ferguson. They're militarizing the police all across America. They purchased 1.6 billion rounds of hollow point ammunition that can only be used on the civilians. It's illegal to use it to oppose a military opponent, and basically everything is being done to prepare for difficult and uncertain times here in the United States. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, SWAT teams now have heavily armored personnel carriers, and for what? Are the local police going to war? But even if they get this stuff for free from the feds, what are you going to do with this equipment? I'll tell you where this always leads. The local sheriff or police is going to demand funding to train people on the vehicle, and that means training a militarized support team as well. So now instead of patrolling the streets, every policeman is taking off time to go out of state to be trained to play soldier, and they come home all gung-ho, itching to use this stuff in battle. That's a recipe for disaster. So as I continue to warn, forget about foreign troops in the U.S. The government is militarizing local police to use this military equipment on its own citizens, as you just said, Stan. And Ferguson is just the kind of justification all small towns need to see the need and come on board. Trouble is, it has backfired. There's now a public backlash brewing against extreme militarization. One congressman from Georgia, Hank Johnson, is introducing a bill to demilitarize partially the police. He said, "Our main streets should be a place for business, families, and relaxation, not tanks and M16s. As the tragedy in Missouri unfolds, one thing is clear," he said, "our local police forces are becoming militarized." The images coming out of Ferguson, which President Obama on Thursday said deeply disturbing, have spurred comparisons with a war zone, with heavily armed police officers pointing weapons at protesters. Some of the protesters have reportedly thrown Molotov cocktails at police.
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment with Joel Skousen talking about the militarization of our police forces. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is talking about the militarization of our police forces, and it's not just in Ferguson, all across the country. Why in heaven's name would certainly the government certainly purchase and then give to certainly the local police forces tanks and armored personnel carriers and all sorts of other heavy armored equipment? Why would the federal government or Office of Homeland Security purchase 1.6 billion rounds of ammunition, hollow point, which can only be used on civilians, can't be used on the military? Why would they do that? And all sorts of AR-15s. They are militarizing American police as Hitler militarized the police in Germany back in the 1930s. And the average individual can't understand that there really are people in government who want to have suddenly a police state in America. And of course, Joel is saying that some of the people out there demonstrating have thrown Molotov cocktails at the police. Joel, do you think that they brought in professional provocateurs, professionals from other regions? How many of the people who are being arrested are from Ferguson, and how many are from out of state and out of that area?
Well, a lot of them from the neighboring black area of Oakland, Missouri, all in the St. Louis area. And, there have been charges about, agent provocateurs, and certainly agent provocateurs have been a standard fare for the U.S. government in provoking terrorism. But unlike Dave Hodges and others who claim that this is simply an excuse to go to martial law in the nation, I just don't see that personally. I think this really is, clearly there are outsiders in there. I think there are a criminal element, however, who take advantage of these things. I just don't see a globalist agenda of provoking this into a larger martial law scenario. In fact, if anything, it has backfired, as I said, on the police forces because people view these armored vehicles as just way over the top and clearly justifying a lot of social unrest against this type of thing. So if anything, there's going to be a movement to stop this militarization of police, or at least to slow it down, rather than to feel justified in all of these things. Well, Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia criticized the Pentagon's 1033 program, which offers surplus military equipment to state and local governments, including M16 automatic rifles and M.r.a.p vehicles. He noted in the last several months those vehicles have been given to cities in Texas, Idaho, Indiana, Minnesota, New York, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arizona, Illinois, and Alabama. This trend, he said, is not only sweeping America's small cities, it's hitting American college campuses as well. Ohio State University recently acquired an M.r.a.p vehicle. Apparently, college kids are getting too rowdy, Johnson said. Can you imagine that? A university having an M.r.a.p vehicle? Ferguson Police Chief Thomas Jackson on Thursday pushed back at criticism of the police response. He says it's not military, it's tactical operations. It's SWAT teams. That's who's out there, police. We're doing this in blue uniforms. This is actually untrue. We've seen the pictures of them in camouflaged army clothes, and that's how they're operating as complete military people. Ferguson Mayor James Knowles similarly defended police conduct, telling MSNBC that he could not second-guess these officers. This is the same lame statement the courts always use, Stan, to excuse themselves from reining in police conduct. This is not about second-guessing anybody. It's about judging their conduct. And if the chief won't judge them and the courts won't judge them, who else is? This permissive behavior is tempting a defense response from the public. I mean, can you imagine that, using as lame excuse? I'm not going to second-guess my officers, meaning I'm not going to judge how they make decisions out of the field. They have to judge, and courts have to judge. And we desperately need that kind of a judgment to rein in bad police behavior. Lawmakers aren't convinced and are increasingly sounding the alarm about the new firepower being wielded by police departments. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who of course is a contender for the GOP nomination in 2016, on Thursday penned an op-ed piece for Time magazine blaming Washington for using federal dollars to help municipal governments build what is essentially a small army. Says there's a legitimate role for the police to keep the peace, but there's a big difference between a police response and a military response. He says, not surprisingly, big government has been at the heart of the problem. Well, sadly, I think, Stan, it's more than a problem of big government agenda. It's a globalist agenda to eventually take down armed dissent in the U.S. And this is partly why all of this military police is being pushed. For example, the number of SWAT raids is no longer the exception. It's the rule. Once you pay an army, or you pay to arm and train these police as military response people, police are going to use them. And the training emphasizes aggressive, weapon-pointing behavior, since this is always a presumption that SWAT is being used against highly armed threats. But hardly ever do SWAT teams encounter highly armed opponents. Most are simply terrorized victims of drug use, who are then really more victimized by the brutality of police than by their own stupidity in using drugs. Almost 80% of all SWAT team deployments are for executing search warrants for drug use. I mean, it's totally inappropriate. And most of the time, those warrants are not even presented to the people. They just bang on the door and use these training to cower victims into gun-pointed silence so that no one dares challenge them. Well, the police get more militaristic and violent in proportion to the military equipment they are given and how they train. I think this is the plan from the very beginning. Forget about mass indoctrination of police, which probably wouldn't be very effective. You just gift them hundreds of tons of military equipment and train them to use it, and then gin up false terrorist or domestic terror threats to convince them that patriotic Americans are the enemy, and voila, You suddenly have trigger-happy cops with a Rambo syndrome. And while you can't lure most patriots into confronting police, you can do so easily in racially sensitive areas like St. Louis, New York, and L.A. The police will get their training on minorities with these equipment, and then will be used later in earnest against globalist dissenters someday, and that's you and me. Increasingly, police are being trained formally to brook no objections from people who confront them, even at traffic stops. This, quote, "don't challenge me" attitude was on display front and center in the Washington Post this week, and the reaction to it has been relatively negative. It was written by a pompous cop who has seen enough rank to think he is kind of a god. Here's what he said. Even though it might sound harsh and impolitic, there is the bottom line. If you don't want to get shot, tasered, pepper sprayed, struck with a baton, or thrown to the ground, just do what I tell you. Don't argue with me. Don't call me names. Don't tell me that I can't stop you. Don't say I'm a racist pig. Don't threaten that they'll sue me and I'll take away my badge. Don't scream at me that you pay my salary. And don't even think of aggressively walking towards me. Well, that was his statement. I think this is just extremely aggressive. Shame on the Post for publishing this, but that's typical of this government shill. This aggressive, everything I demand is right attitude is sadly increasingly common with police. I like Associate News reporter Larry Womack's response best in the Huffington Post when he said, "I'm an American citizen. If you want to remain a cop, don't violate my rights." In other words, don't tell me to do what I say, just don't violate my rights. And that is exactly right, and I would add, don't violate my rights, and if you do, I'm allowed to tell you so to your face without expecting you to get aggressive or violent. The officer who wrote that claims to have worked in Internet affairs, but that's a little difficult to swallow. Says, I'm quoting from Womack now in the Huffington Post. Well, it's not difficult for me to swallow. The cop knows very well of police mistakes and is refusing to acknowledge them in his eagerness to push his readers into abject compliance. Womack continues, after all, this man, he says, must know the police officers will regularly produce badges before raping sex workers, and over 10% of juvenile inmates report being sexually abused by jailers. He should know better than make a statement like, if you don't want to get shot, tasered, just do what I tell you. But this idea that cops get to say when and where constitutional rights apply is so deeply misguided that I am shocked anyone would type it out without coming to their senses mid-sentence. After all, if you want to get kicked off jury duty, the fastest way is just to say, if a cop arrested her, he must have been doing the right thing, or that she must have been doing something wrong. Our entire system of criminal justice is built around the idea that law enforcement people are imperfect, and that's why the courts and juries need oversight. There's an experience I think every reporter has had, wrote Womack, at least once. You're filming or photographing something in public and a police officer demands that you stop. It is not a request, it's a demand made with some show of force. On the second demand, as if by training, they usually indicate that they are explicitly ordering you to stop. A deputy sheriff once sped his SUV, parked about 20 feet away, toward me as a means of punctuating an order. I had to jump out of its path. He or she will likely threaten to take your camera or arrest you. Still, I've been threatened by police officers for doing my job on 4 occasions, wrote Womack. In each of those cases, the police officer backed down after being calmly informed that he was a public person in the public place with no reasonable expectation of privacy. You know, stuff he should already know. I've been lucky, I suppose. I interject here, not really, it's because of what he says next. And I knew each time that the only reason I wasn't being arrested was because I came across as the type of person with a means of recourse. What he's saying is I came across as a journalist, and obviously a journalist can make his police chief look very bad in print.
Well, hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen.
architects. America's now...
All right, Joel, go right ahead.
Well, I'm reading from a response from a reporter for the Associate Journal to the Washington Post cop giving a certain cop an op-ed piece about, everybody, if you don't want to get hurt, just do what we tell you. He says, Womack says, what have always troubled me most about these incidents, if you can believe it, is the inescapable impression that officers really believe that they have the right to issue these orders under threat of arrest. As if a law meant to allow cops to direct traffic somehow trumps the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. They don't need no stinking Constitution. They have guns and handcuffs, writes Womack. Well, in Ferguson last week, reporters for the Washington Post and Huffington Post were arrested, essentially for being inside a McDonald's. When the police chief learned of the arrest, he blamed an officer who, quote, didn't know better. Didn't know better than to arrest someone who wasn't committing a crime, or didn't know better than to arrest a reporter. False arrest, it seems, only happens to people of means. This week, it was even worse. In Ferguson, Missouri, there was a shocking video footage showing a police officer pointing his gun directly at protesters and the press while remarking, "I'm going to blankety-blank kill you," using the F word. Still, what do we do when cops show they can't handle the demand for their job? Do we educate them? No, we arm them, because bad decisions are made so much better with deadly weapons. Police in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and South Carolina are being gifted mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. That's the M.r.a.p vehicle. What the hell is a cop in Oklahoma going to do, writes Womack, with an M.r.a.p, but overreact? Landmines are not a big problem in Tulsa. In the United States, it continues, however, we are currently left with a deadly mix of peaceful protests, violent agitators, and overarmed cops enacting the scene of a government at war with its people. A cop shot the suspect of a $50 cigar heist 6 times, and law enforcement's response has been tear gas, batons, and bullets. Playing soldier. So forgive me, writes Womack, if I have a hard time accepting it when a cop cries that the real problem is that you challenged my authority. End quote. What Womack describes as an egregious example of everything that's wrong with modern police attitudes. Don't even think about challenging me, he says, with the assumption that police would never be guilty of requiring anything improper. Nothing could be further from the truth. The police are always demanding performance that is unconstitutional and take the most aggressive stand against those who challenge that authority on constitutional grounds. It doesn't help that Eric Holder, the corrupt Obama Attorney General, is in town massaging the crowds and claiming to do a federal investigation. What the administration is doing is merely grandstanding for political purposes. Yes, there is a need for a federal investigation, but bad cops and bad police chiefs never get sent to jail. There is indeed past evidence of racial prejudice and minority bad-mouthing in the St. Louis County Police Force. A Lieutenant Patrick Hayes was fired a few years ago for pushing the idea that let's arrest more blacks and have a more colorful jail cell, meaning more people of color in jail. To be fair, there is some justification for the high rate of arrest and search.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is simply talking about seems to be an attitude in this part of Missouri, or surrounding St. Louis, an attitude that we really ought to be arresting more blacks to try to keep them in line, to show them where they should be. And this is not the attitude. People should be judged by what they do, not by the color of their skin. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, let me discuss that a little bit about the fact that we are dealing with a majority black population, and they do have a higher percentage of the arrests. To be fair, I think there is some justification for the high rate of arrest and search for persons of color in this area. While the racial makeup of Ferguson is 63% black, minorities of color account for 93% of all arrests, 86% of all police stops, and 92% of police searches. In point of fact, poor black communities do have a very high percentage of crime and social problems. Very few marriages remain intact, and delinquency among black teens in public schools is rampant. So is welfarism, bad language, poor health standards, alcoholism, and drugs. Class judgments are inevitable when you have a base problem with the population with chronic bad judgment. There are exceptions, of course, but it takes a lot of discipline and sensitivity to see past the group and judge each person as an individual, as should be required. When I look through the videos and see the local police chief and cops expressing their southern macho, bring it on bravado, I'm not impressed that white cops are doing a proper job of being careful. It's just too easy to get into bad habits of insensitivity and aggressiveness when confronted with a mass of problem humanity. One of the most disturbing aspects of this week's problems is that we have some testimony that's come out lately about whether or not the shooting of Michael Brown was justified. In this section, I'm going to cover the crux of the controversy now in Ferguson, whether or not Michael Brown stole cigars beforehand, had a long rap sheet, or whether he assaulted the officer in a violent manner justifying the shooting. But before examining the evidence, I think it's important to point out that police have been exhibiting some strange behavior in releasing damaging leaks about Brown's past each and every time they release information the public is demanding. For example, while the police chief continually downplayed the number of shots fired, he was on record as saying, oh yeah, he fired a couple of shots, or maybe a few more, when asked at a news conference. Two different agencies demanded different autopsies and both came up with Brown being hit 6 times, not 2, not 3. The friend who was with Brown says he was shot first while walking away from the policeman and then turned around to confront the officer. The autopsy does show that there was one shot from the back to the front of back to front in the forearm. But at this point, it's impossible to know if it was done while he was walking away, as the witness said, or when he had his hands up facing the police. That would also explain a back of the arm to front of the arm bullet. Either way, however, such a shot was unjustified. Shouldn't have been shooting him in the back, and he shouldn't have been shooting him in the front if his hands were raised. There was also a shot to the top of the head, the last and the fatal one, according to witnesses, indicating he was shot while going down. Also infinite evidence of excessive force. Second, much has been made of his altercation at the store where it was alleged that he stole a few cigars. This is now in dispute, as no charges were filed against Brown's accomplice, and who was with him at the store during the altercation. And the video also shows Brown putting money on the counter before grabbing the cigars. And I give a link in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief by William Grigg on that story. But the most important part of the story is that police went out of their way to secure copies of that video on the day that they released the name of the officer who shot him, obviously trying to predispose the crowd to Brown's negative character as a bully. That is particularly bad ethics on the part of the police chief, because he already knew that the officer, Darren Wilson, had not received and was not acting on the 911 call by a customer in the store. The shop employee did not call 911 or even report this incident as a crime. But the next leak by police this week was far more damning about Brown, if it is true. I'll discuss the problems after I read it to you, but listening to Michael Brown's prior arrest, the rap sheet, and the convictions prove the anonymous leaker was from the police. Nobody else had access to a rap sheet on a person up for trial. Neither would anyone outside law enforcement have any access to the following witness statements. Do I hear the break coming up, Stan?
You do, and we'll be back here in just a moment. Our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. We're talking about Brown. We're talking about his background. We're talking about his rap sheet. But the police officer did not have access to that information.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance
of course, the thing that Joel is bringing out is the fact that certainly the police certainly did not release this information until after the man had been shot. Of course, releasing the information about Brown's past criminal activity is used to somehow justify the fact that he was shot, whereas, of course, the police officer was not dealing with that. A police officer was dealing with a young man who was certainly, for whatever reason, was walking away from him and then turned around and started coming back for him. He was unarmed, and he was shot 6 times. He was shot 6 times, and 2 of them were in the head. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, then, and this is indication of the police deliberately planting disinformation or misinformation around the net. This post was done anonymously, and it first of all started out with a rap sheet of all the various convictions that Michael Brown had, which only a police officer could have. And then he writes the following. This was posted at various different websites. And, I covered in the World Affairs Brief several weeks ago that the government has a full-time division of people at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida that do nothing but ply the Internet and act as if they are independent people posting to the Internet, and they give out, misinformation and disinformation and try to counter right-wing arguments on this thing. We're paying these people with federal dollars. But the mere fact that this leaker and this anonymous guy was posting this stuff all around the Internet, and it did get passed around, indicates that this is a very, how should I say, unprofessional way. If the police want to do something and counter the story, they should be doing it openly in their name, not with an unofficial leaker. But here's what was being posted. That so-called kid has a rap sheet a mile long already. Did you know that the unarmed teen was 6'3" and 300 pounds, and that according to witnesses in the complex, the unarmed teen, along with another suspect, blocked the officer's vehicle from responding to a call by standing in front of it. Other words were exchanged. The innocent teen rushed the officer, tackled him back into the driver's seat of the police car. As the unarmed teen was on top of the officer beating... Hold
that thought, Joel. We'll be back here in just a moment as we begin to continue exploring the truth about what really took place. Well, Dr. Stan and Joel is simply pointing out that somebody, whether it's the government, whoever it is posting suddenly material on the Internet, suddenly, and everything is to demean Brown. He's 300 pounds, he's over 6 foot tall. He's got a rap sheet, suddenly a very long rap sheet. He's been involved in all sorts of criminal activity. This is obviously to discredit him, to justify somehow shooting him 6 times when he's unarmed. Go right ahead.
Well, actually, the rap sheet doesn't show a lot of criminal activity. It shows some fairly minor criminal activity. But nevertheless, it was for the purpose of discrediting this. But then this next witness statement, if true, really is a damning statement, because what it indicates is that there was some very aggressive behavior, and that and as he said, after words were exchanged, the quote innocent teen rushed the officer, tackled him back into the driver's seat of the police car. As the unarmed teen was on top of the officer, beating him to where his face had several concussions and his eye was still shut this morning. Of course, only a fellow police officer would know that. The officer went for his gun and fired. Now, this is obviously another policeman in the Bureau giving the excuses of Darren Wilson, the officer, giving his side of the story. He continues, I think we can all agree that the officer should have let the unarmed teen beat him to death rather than fire the shot because he was an unarmed teenager. So you see, he's using some sarcasm here to justify this. After the round goes off, the unarmed teen backs out of the car and starts walking away. The officer is just severely assaulted by being punched in the head repeatedly. He points his gun at the teen, tells him he's under arrest. The unarmed teen turns around, and according to the witness, again, the witnesses in the complex, the teen starts yelling at the officer, daring him to shoot. Well, according to the other witness, he doesn't dare him to shoot. He says, are you going to shoot me? Because in fact, this shows how the story differs here. The officer is claiming that he turns around, but the witness says he shot at him while he was turned with his back to the officer. and hit him in the back of the arm. Then the teenager turns around, raises his hands and says, "Are you going to shoot me?" This version is declaring this as a dare. He again rushes the officer, at which point the officer who has just been beaten fires at the unarmed innocent teen. So here's the problem I have with this leak. First of all, why wait till over a week later, after all the violence has begun and gotten out of hand over the perceived injustice, to reveal this? In other words, this would clearly have stated, or disarmed the public outrage if the public had known this. And why do this through a leaker rather than an official statement where it would have more official credibility? Number two, if the officer was beaten so severely, the police would have photographed his wounded face immediately so that they would have proof that Brown had assaulted him. But even if we suppose that they didn't want to show the pictures for fear of revealing the officer's identity, why didn't they at least make the verbal statement that Brown had severely beaten a police officer? This would have gone a long way towards showing that the officer had acted in self-defense. Now, these are important questions which either point to an extremely incompetent police chief or the desires to cover up something by manufacturing a crime to justify lethal force, an all too common practice by corrupt police. I don't know which at this point, but the track record of police abuse is now so widespread that there is no way I'm going to trust the official police statements or these kinds of leaks without a complete airing of all the facts, something which rarely ever happens nowadays. Now, one of the other things which is most disturbing about this story, Stan, is that during the night of, or just recently here, as Michael Snyder covered, a lot of the stores were being looted and police refused to respond and interdict against the looting. This is exactly what happened in the the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. And Michael Snyder responds and says, if the police are not going to lift a finger to stop rampant theft, then what in the world are they there for? Why don't they just pack up and leave the streets completely? They're just there to confront protesters and arrest journalists. All they are accomplishing is inflaming the situation. And is this not what we can expect when civil unrest spreads to more cities throughout America? Will you not be able to depend on the police to protect your homes and your businesses from looting? What I'm about to share with you are excerpts, says Snyder, from the mainstream news reports about how the police did nothing to stop the looting. To me, this stand down by the police is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Ferguson riots so far. Here's USA Today. During the night, buildings burned, windows shattered, and chaos ensued as protesters stood in the streets criticizing police. Officers threatened to arrest protesters and yet did nothing to stop any looters as citizens moved to protect local businesses from sporadic theft. This is from a local Fox affiliate in St. Louis. It said police presence is in question after St. Louis County and Missouri State Highway Patrol officers left the scene once looters began attacking businesses overnight. Protesters believe the media has started to confuse the difference between themselves and the looters. Fights have begun on the streets as well as social media, with some believing that this has become similar to a game of chess. And this from Fox News itself. A reporter from the station tweeted that police cars were being driven past some of the stores being looted and did not respond. Store owners standing outside their businesses holding guns told Fox News, too, that when they called 911, they were sent from one police agency to another and got no response. One of the owners with a large black gun resting on his shoulder told the station that police were lined up blocks from the looting and did not engage looters making off with large boxes from these stores. There's no police, he said. We trusted the police to keep the peace, but they didn't do their job. So this is very discouraging, Stan, when this happens here. and it forces citizens to take matters into their own hands, which is what also happened in Los Angeles when you saw people in gun stores, for example, with rifles mounted on top of their store willing to shoot people if they were going to loot their guns. I find it unconscionable that police take such aggressive and armed measures against largely peaceful protesters and journalists and yet fail to arrest outright looters. The bottom line is that you can't depend on police to protect you, and that's why, partly, we have the Second Amendment. Well, that's the story on the rioting stand there. The next story I wanted to talk about was the beheading of James Foley as a new provocation for war. There's something strange about this story, too, as I'm going to explain here, and as Paul Joseph Watson from Infowars.com analyzed. It seems as if, Al-Qaeda was wearing off on people and now they need a new boogeyman in the terrorist war, and that's why the U.S. created ISIS. And now they also need a new horrifying beheading, as they used to put out against Al-Qaeda and doing it against ISIS. And there's some strange things which make this story questionable. As the UK Telegraph said, or James Green reports, that the British police are saying that even watching the video of the beheading can be considered an act of terror. This is incredible, Stan. And I'm quoting from The Guardian now, or The Telegraph. The Metropolitan Police Service, or MPS, Counterterrorism Command, is investigating the contents of the video that was posted online in relation to the alleged murder of James Foley. We would like to remind the public that viewing, downloading, or disseminating extremist material within the UK constitutes a crime. I'm sure legislation does not mention viewing, but this shows the egregious escalation of police interpretation of law, granting them draconian powers under the false threat of terrorism. As I pointed out recently, it appears that the public became very tired of government parading the Al-Qaeda threat before them, justifying the escalating war against liberty in the U.S. Thus, a new enemy has been funded and created, ISIS, which is busy rampaging through Iraq. The Washington Times, which often exacerbates the Islamic threat based upon the steady dribble of government propaganda, did so again this week, parroting the government's claim about ISIS going to target Americans and the British. All this is based on the dubious premise of thousands of Brits joining ISIS. And I ask, how would they know this? And then coming back to wreak havoc at home. Today's horrific videotaped beheading of American photojournalist James Foley was packaged with the new Islamic State posting on social media threatening the U.S., "We will drown all of you in blood." It visibly angered Obama, said the newspaper, gave a stern reply Wednesday afternoon, saying in a televised address that the U.S. and its allies will work together to extract this cancer that is the Islamic State. Well, Stan, anytime Obama gets on television, the globalists are pushing something. And this clearly means another larger war in Iraq and Syria. This may well be the back door into Syria that I have been anticipating. Since the U.S. got stuck with the Kerry-induced chemical weapons dismantling agreement in Syria, the U.S. has had to conjure up another reason to intervene. I think building up ISIS as the new monster is the perfect vehicle, and it will lead from F-18 attacks in Iraq back to Syria, which is the root, of course, of ISIS and its home base, which we help to fund and support.
And I think that's so vitally important. We help to fund and support. If you doubt that, if you say this couldn't be true, go up on the internet and go to your search engine and type in CIA funds, CIA trains, CIA arms ISIS. You'll find that that's exactly what happened. We created the best enemy money could buy so we can justify our war. And it's the same thing they did during the First World War with all the atrocity stories of the wicked Huns cutting off the breasts of their Belgian women, the hands, the little Belgian boys, and they just had all their atrocity stories in the Second World War, and remember, of course, the first Gulf War, where they were throwing little children out of the bassinets and bayoneting them in the nurseries. And now, of course, we have the new story. Go right ahead, Joel. It's obviously they want another war. Joel, are you there? Joel, are you there? Well, it looks like we're having some problems. I'm not sure what we do at this point. Joel, are you there? I'm going to have to get our producer to try to get our gentleman here so we can find out what's happened. Anyway, of course, I think it's vitally important that you understand what Joel is saying. And basically, he is simply pointing out what we've been trying to tell you for some time. And that is this, that they want a war. They create all sorts of enemies. We finance, tragically, suddenly so much of what goes on. And if you get in the background of the funding of Al-Qaeda, you get into the background of the funding, suddenly, oh, Joel, are you there? Joel, are you there? Joel? Joel is going. Hopefully, our son will be here. He's our producer, and we'll know how we can get Joel back on again. But I think it's vitally important, ladies and gentlemen, that you understand that you can tell when there's going to be a war because they come up with all this propaganda. And isn't this a wonderful story? They're saying we're going to drown you in blood. And then, of course, this justifies certainly the terrible atrocities that have come about. And certainly the last thing we need is another war in the Middle East. What in heaven's name are we doing over there? We should be pulling out of that area completely. We need people to defend America, not simply, try to create more problems. Joel, are you there? Well, unfortunately, we get into some problems with communication, but Joel is on the road, and hopefully we're going to be able to get him back again. But you must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that World War III, I believe, is imminent, and whether this will, the war that's coming in Iraq, when we're going to be bringing our troops in for a battle between certainly Syria and Iraq and the enemy, or whether it's going to be a much larger war with Russia. I think that's where it's going to be down the line. But we do need for people to understand that there's a real problem. And hopefully we're going to be able to get back with Joel here in a moment or two. If you have a question or comment, don't be bashful. Give us a call at 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. But you must understand that if the good people of America are not involved and not speaking out, why this small little group that controls the United States will take us into another war, and this is exactly what they're intending to do. We have told you, and if you have not read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to. And basically, of course, what we find certainly with the Brotherhood of Darkness is that we have a small group, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 people at the most, but they're people of great wealth and great influence, and they control both political parties. They control the major banks. There are 6 major banks that control 67% of the financial assets of our country. That's J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, the Bank of America, the Wells Fargo, and the Goldman Sachs. And basically, they are all controlled by this little group of people. They control 90% of the media, and basically, that's the media suddenly controls what goes on, and because that is AOL, Time Warner, Bertelsmann, Viacom, Disney, the Comcast, and of course Murdoch. They control 90% of the media, and they largely determine what the American people think and believe. And our job, of course, is to try to get you to understand that they have already taken over control of America. They control both political parties, which is certainly why we are not actually doing anything at all about what's going on over there. We're not trying to impeach Obama. They could certainly get people to vote one way or the other on the impeachment of Obama, but they're not going to do that. And basically, they control both political parties, and they're using the financial and military power of the United States to bring about a world government. And the only thing you can do is get the information. If you'd like to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. If you want to know how they control the media, the book is The New Media Monopoly. The New Media Monopoly, both available by calling 1-800-544-8927.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair, as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie to the ocean, white with gold. God bless America, my home sweet home. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie to the ocean.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye, Dad. Don't be late.
No?
White with gold. God bless America, my home sweet
Right, Pop? Right, son.
God bless America, land that I love. Beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountain to the prairie to the ocean.
Well, this is Dr. Stan back here, and certainly we have to understand that there's a very real possibility that we're going to be moving into a war in the Middle East. And of course, they'll use this atrocity, this horrible story about the Sunday journalist who gets beheaded, and they show us all the gory pictures of this. But ladies and gentlemen, they're playing games with your mind. Would they actually kill the journalist? Of course they would kill a journalist. We've killed countless millions of people. Suddenly we got into World War I when there was no reason to, and suddenly prolonged the war for another year and killed probably an additional 5 million people. We got into World War II, and basically they killed 60 to 70 million people there, and most of it was totally unnecessary. But you see, it's all about bringing about a one world government. So initially, it was the League of Nations for World War I. Suddenly it was the United Nations for World War II. And they planned to have another great world war to bring about a world government, because that has been Satan's plan going all the way back to the time of Nimrod. And of course, they tried this over and over again. The Assyrians tried it, the Persians, the Medes, and the Egyptians all tried to create a world government. The Greeks, the Romans. This has been tried time and time again. Certainly Napoleon, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, they all wanted a world government. But we've never come as close as we are right now, because, of course, we have this small little group that controls the United States and England and most of Europe. They have their people planted in key positions. They're not the choice of the individuals. They certainly control the media, and they run two candidates, and you can vote for the candidate of their choice. They're using their military and political power of the United States to bring about a world government. But how are they going to get us into a war over there? Well, this atrocity story of beheading the journalist and maybe even beheading a few more. But they've already killed millions of people. They don't care how many people they kill. You must understand we're up against organized evil. And if you haven't read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to get it. Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to get James Perloff's wonderful book, Shadows of Power, and Ted Flynn's book. They're all available by calling 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. And these people have already killed countless millions of people, and millions more will die as long as they hold the reins of power, and they control the media, and they can control the reality of the American people. So you can certainly sit back and say, look, I don't want to hear all of this. I just want to live my life and be left alone. But they're not going to let you live your life and be left alone, ladies and gentlemen. They're waiting for the good old days to come back, and they're not going to come back. I've been at this for 52 years now. I believe we're moving towards a climax in history. And if you're out there, you need to get informed, you need to get involved, and you need to join in this epic struggle for the survival of Western civilization and the souls of men. So we ask you certainly to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, to get the book certainly under control of the media, the new media monopoly, both available by calling 1-800-544-8927. If you'd like to know how they tend to kill tens of millions of people here in America, you need to get our new 4-CD set on dangerous electricity. It has dangerous electricity, and of course we have so many other things on population control. If you want to know about Vietnam, we have actually 4 CD sets on that. And certainly you can get my interview with General Lew Walt, a 4-star Marine general. That's on DVD. The others are CD sets. But our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. Our webpage is radioliberty.com. If you sit back and do nothing, you'll have nobody to blame as we lose our freedom, and you'll spend your twilight years telling your children and your children's children what it was to live in America when men were free. Join us in this epic struggle for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization.
I'll be grateful.